hurricane. So this begins to take on the shape of something very different in the way of a disaster and how we navigate the aftermath. I have come to love deeply the people, the tribe that I now named the shipwrecked. You know, those of us who at some point in our lives had the feeling of the rug being pulled from beneath our feet. Everything we treasured, built, earned, our lives as we had shaped them, the ways in which we had crafted for ourselves this sense of safety, security, predictability, and routine suddenly ripped away. And in that experience of being shipwrecked, I say it's war or weather, loss of health or wealth. These are the things that upend our lives and send us scurrying and scrambling for higher ground. And then at those moments, of course, what we hope is someone reaches out and pulls us ashore. But we are different. We are different afterward than we were before. And so the true nature of a disaster for me also is that thing that forever in your life represents a milestone such that before and after are two separate parts of your journey. So I threw in my lot with the shipwreck and during Katrina, and it's still the people I most want to be with. I have worked long-term recovery in my own Gulf Coast community after Allison, Katrina, Rita, Ike, Gustav, Edward, Harvey, Imelda, and so forth. So I know too much about hurricanes, but the genuine honor of having worked also in Germany as Syrians were being resettled, to go to Jordan and Lebanon to work with refugees in camps there, to be connected over time with wonderful people like Daryl and Helen in Australia. These are my shipwreck people, and I love you. So every disaster begins with, we're all in the same boat. And this is a lovely painting that was done by a woman I worked with for many years, and it's called The Hopefuls. And of course, whether war or weather upend our lives, we become one of the hopefuls. We are casting our lot with our community members and our neighbors in the hope that somehow we can stay together, creating something that works for all of us. We've seen with COVID and some other disasters that the ship that some of us are in is much more seaworthy than the ship that others are in, and we reach out now with an understanding that all boats are not created equal, and we have the great effort that must go into recovery of understanding that the starting place for some individuals is different than others. But we should treasure the moments, however brief, that we experience where we come together and we see our common humanity. We embrace the notion, and we see clearly that the journey we're all on is one where we're vulnerable to upheaval, to disaster, to displacement. This is something we have in common. So this may seem to you in some way a sad statement. People actually walk up to me in airports, say, "Oh my God, you're Angela. No one's coming." And I would like to be actually known for something catchier. I'm Cajun, perhaps even something funnier. But I start in disaster recovery with "no one's coming," because the communities that fare the best work, don't wait. They work, don't wait. On the Gulf Coast, we've learned every day you wait, the situation worsens, becomes more costly, becomes more dire, and actually threatens more lives. So communities that understand, first, their vulnerability, and second, that they must work, not wait, that no one's coming. In Harvey, I ran a mass shelter. My specialty is long-term recovery and community rebuilding, but I was thrown into the emergent phase, to the most dire part of Harvey, because FEMA couldn't get here, Red Cross didn't get here, no one came. We were on our own as it continued to rain, and it was necessary to put everything that I knew about long-term recovery and that I understood about sheltering from my travels around the world to work on a mass shelter for over 8,000 people, many of whom were actually making their way to NRG from shelters that had been safe but had gone underwater. I could have said, I don't do emergencies, I don't do shelters. What we did in Houston is we said it's up to us. The systems and people and institutions we count on can't get here. We have to do this ourselves. And how do we marshal the resources? For me, no one's coming is a strong, empowering statement. If it's your community, you're there, you're present. There's no one bigger, better, faster, stronger that knows more, understands better what's important than you. You own it. It may not be what you chose, but it's yours now. So that's the good news. As leaders, I feel like we've seen the destructive impact of leaders that don't know how to tell us what they know in a way that we need to understand it. So as leaders, my number one advice, I ran an organization of over 1,200 employees and 7,000 volunteers in 71 locations, serving over 500,000 people with the principle, when I know it, you know it. That I want everyone I work with to understand I won't withhold anything, I won't parse anything, I won't subtract and add and divide by 2 to make it more palatable. I will tell you what I know when I know it, and I want you to do the same. Because if we have a shared grasp of our starting place, we're much better off. Many of you might be familiar with Simon Sinek's work. As leaders after disaster, I think you have a powerful purpose, and that's to remind everyone of the why. If you can articulate a why, you can get to the we that you need to rebuild. So when we start out in the level of what are we going to do? If we start first with what, we end up fighting. When I worked in New Orleans after Katrina, you know, when people started with, well, what should we rebuild here? What should we rebuild there? People started competing, and they got furious and angry with one another. But when they started with the why of New Orleans and the why of Lower Ninth and the why of Lakeview and Central City and all of the other vital Treme, those critical vital neighborhoods. What is so powerful and important about this neighborhood? Why do we care so much about it? We get united around the why and what is so important about Paradise and those communities and what people valued about living there. When we move out from why to how we're going to rebuild, then when we get to what, we can be together in a way we can't if we start on the outer part of that circle. So as leaders, whenever a conflict arises, you have this important purpose of stating, this is why this is so important. This is why we're together. And reminding the people of the narrative, that narrative throughout the recovery process. Now this is another, I once wrote this for an article that was reviewed by a copywriter in New York. And she said to me, you know, you can't say this. You can't build on broken. It's not grammatical. It should be written instead. One cannot build on that which is broken. And I said, I'm sure that's grammatical, but in Texas, where I come from, nobody would understand that. We understand you can't build on broken. We cannot have the starting place be the loss. This does not mean we don't acknowledge loss, and I'm going to get to that. But we must be the kind of people that can scan any devastated environment and identify, note, scan for and note what is there to work with, who's there, what's there, and how do we put it together in a new way. So I love New Orleans for what it represents as a city. It is very much part and parcel of the culture I come from. as a Cajun person. And in New Orleans, you see musicians all the time. They walk out on the street, they have their instrument, they take their instrument out of the case and they begin to play. They don't wait for an audience. There's no money in the case. There's no program handed out. So improvisation wins in the aftermath of disaster. It wins because it's the do what you can with what you have, where you are, and I added right now. This is powerful because it's inherently asset-based, but it also allows you to draw on anything that anyone has to offer. And it allows you to begin before the aid arrives, before the help is there, before the policies are established, before the results are guaranteed. So as leaders, we want to both be open to improvisation and willing to encourage it in others. So earlier, Daryl spoke about the 7 stages. I'm working really hard on what I call my shipwreck project. And in that project, I've identified the steps and stages people move through. But I'm speaking today about one in particular. We come to a fork in the road, usually around a year, usually around an anniversary. And in that fork of the road, one fork is acceptance. We don't know why. We've stopped thinking about who's at fault. The people we're angry with because they built no protection for the Gulf Coast. The fury we feel at the mismanagement of forests at the fury we feel at those that don't recognize the climate changes that are accelerating the impacts of these events on our lives. We put that aside and we say, for whatever reason, this is where we are. And we commit to begin again. I will tell you with great love and gentleness that that is the only path to a vibrant community. The path of resignation goes through this dark forest of whose fault is it, and all the failures of others that cause the suffering that we're now having. And while all of that is perfectly legitimate, it has to be abandoned for the creative process of recreating community. So I'm going to tell you this is like a little Cajun diversion, okay? So the quick story, I really pretty much wiped out Galveston. There were very few immediately habitable homes left when I hit Galveston. I was down there to do some work and I saw this bar, and it was an old, we would call it a dive bar, you know, not fancy, but a good honky tonk, probably a great neighborhood place to hang out and have fun. And the signage had been washed away, and a few of the boards on the side of it as well. But what someone had done is hand paint a sign, and the sign said, "Hard Times and Misery Saloon," which is such a Texas thing, you know? So what I really say to people, yes, the pain is real, but don't go into the Hard Times and Misery Saloon, climb up on the bar stool, and spend the rest of your life telling the story of how abused your community was, how neglected, abandoned, and so forth. Not because it isn't true, but it isn't the path to the rejuvenated, rebuilt, regenerated life that you're seeking. When Houston was faced with the challenge of welcoming our neighbors and family members, over 150,000 after Katrina, we exulted in that challenge. The hurricane hadn't hit us. We had triumphed over past storms. We had a chance to be heroes and to roll out a welcome for people that were in every way our people. And as we did that, in the joy we felt, the competency we felt around that was real. And we were justified in feeling, if not, well, in Texas, we'll brag about anything, right? Bragging is a Texas thing. But even if not bragging, we were right to feel a bit of pride in the fact that we could pull this off. It was something we really wanted to do. When we help people, when we find ways to bring resources and support to them, whether we realize it or not, it often comes with the expectation they'll be grateful. Because of course we expect gratitude. We would feel it if we were receiving help. But this is what we must understand. And the Syrians in Germany drove this home to me more than any other group of people. At every milestone, there will be gratitude and grief in equal measure. The lovely woman, please forgive me that I can't see you and I can't see her name, who spoke about losing her home right at the beginning. Yes, there's gratitude for the new home, but at every milestone, at every holiday, every corner of that new home and that rebuilt life is a reminder of also what's been lost. So one part of the art of navigating disaster is to allow grief and gratitude to live next to one another in your heart. Not to feel that you must feel all the time either one, but understand that they exist side by side, and that not believe that a person expressing the grief over loss is somehow failing to acknowledge the fact that they've gotten a replacement. So this is extremely important if you're a helper, because many Houstonians said, well, they've got jobs and houses and cars, and you know, in Houston, we don't have beauty or we don't have New Orleans music and or food, or so a job and a house and a car, that's our, you know, that's our best bargain. And so people who had lost history and community and family and everywhere they looked, markers that reminded them of who they were. And what we had to offer was a job, a house, and a car. So we learned to appreciate and have a space for their grief. And even as we understood them, to appreciate the blessings that we had to offer. And I want to say to this, to those of you now in California who are finding a way to bring back a community after this devastating fire, I am so sorry. Whatever I have to say about the experience, however I might appear to celebrate humans at their most extraordinary in this remarkable ability we have to recreate our lives after disaster, in my heart, I feel for you that I would wish that you wouldn't have this suffering, and I'm so sorry that this has happened to your community. I think as leaders, I've witnessed people show up to help in communities who forgot that that maybe is the first thing that should come, the first message that should come, when we are, especially when it's raw and new. I recall after Katrina, the Urban Land Institute folks showing up in New Orleans about really almost just a few weeks after you could finally go back, with a grand plan for how New Orleans could be rebuilt, with, of course, some vital neighborhoods being returned to swamp. This was not appreciated. I think of us often as we go into communities impacted by disaster. I remind myself each time that we are treading on sacred ground, you know, places that people fought for, bled for, earned, and suffered to create, and now are suffering at the loss. So the hardest time for me facing being able to say to a group of people, I am so sorry, was to be in Ferguson, Missouri, about a year after the murder of Michael Brown, to be able to say to people there, I am so sorry, and not walk away from the fact, not dilute it by saying, oh, I know I didn't do it, or it's not my fault, or it came before. All the ways we have, particularly in the US, of trying to swipe left on whatever led up to it. When we come in from outside the community, whether we did it or not, we own it. And a deep expression of regret is owed and necessary, and it opens the door for a different conversation. So in New Orleans, we know how to hold a funeral. So if those of you who've not ever experienced a funeral in New Orleans, there's a somber march through the streets you know, with the casket, and sometimes carried on in a carriage, horse-driven carriage. Behind it are mournful, are the mourners walking to a mournful tune played by a jazz band. And then the burial occurs and people leave the cemetery and march in a joyful procession through the streets. And as they march, they gather people from the streets who will march in a second line. And the declaration is, of course, that this person's gone and we go on. And the art of holding a funeral in your community is one of the most powerful things you can do. Sometimes we want people to just get over that, the destruction of a community center that was where we spent our whole childhood. We want to ignore the loss of all of the monuments and milestones and the places we fell in love and had our first dance, kiss, and so forth, and they're gone. But what I learned when I saw it in Lower Ninth, this wonderful woman, Patricia Jones, is she held a funeral in Lower Ninth for what was lost, what wasn't coming back, both the people and the structures and the community centers and the things that were just gone. And it may seem odd to do that, but that acknowledgement and releasing those things, not pretending they didn't matter or they never existed or they were insignificant, but to hold a funeral for them. And she did that on the anniversary of when the storm hit. People gathered at a break in the levee, brought with them anything that reminded them of the people that were gone, and then also brought mementos of the places that were gone forever. And they said goodbye to them, and she told me that that was the moment where recovery began. That until that time, every time they took a step toward recovery, they had guilt, because in some way they felt they were betraying or acting as if what had been there didn't matter when they tried to build something new. So the art of holding a funeral that allows us to acknowledge what came before. I'm getting close to final remarks here. The work of recovery is long and it's difficult. And there are people with extraordinary skill that show up in the emergency phase, and we celebrate them because they are possessed of the kind of energy that we need. My son is like that. He's a live action figure. If you need it climbed, built, destroyed, rebuilt, moved, he's your guy. He's not the guy that can do it for the long haul. He's not a person you assign 57,000 new cases to and where you help people navigate bureaucracies. So understanding the art of rebuilding your community, there are people early, middle, late. And we would ask after Ike hit us in Houston, we had this wonderful collaboration that we built. This Katrina taught us, but we would say to people every week, are you in, are you out? And it was perfectly okay to be out. What we didn't want is a collaboration. We wanted a coalition of the willing and not a collaboration of people pretending that they still could do this work. We said, thank you for what you've done, and we said goodbye, and it was perfectly okay. So as leaders, you want to make sure, in whatever you've formed as a group to work on things, it has to be all right for people to come at any point, leave at any point. So we had organizations that were phenomenal in the early stages, left to be replaced by remarkable organizations and individuals that showed up for that middle stage, and then still followed by those that were such long-term persisters that they turned out to be precisely perfect for the latter part of that stage. We took 5 years, it was 5 years for us to actually resettle permanently every single displaced person after Katrina. No one who started was going to finish that 5-year walk with us. Are you in or are you out? It's a powerful question. So this I've asked, these are 2 questions I've asked of a lot of leaders, community builders. This is you understanding you and where you fit in. What commitments have you made to your community? What promises have you offered on behalf of either your work or that of your organization? And then what are you holding yourself accountable for? With COVID, I've worked with a lot of communities impacted by COVID with nonprofit leaders trying to figure out how to navigate this global pandemic. And what I've seen that is really destructive, that I'm slightly warning you against, and you may already know it, you may already know all of this actually, is anyone holding on to the shore, struggling to maintain all the commitments and promises they made before we went into this, they're going to drown. So we really have to be mindful and do a constant reflection on what our commitments have we made, and more importantly, which ones must be renegotiated, and then what are we holding ourselves accountable for so that it stays within the realm of possibility. So this is a photograph. It was given to me by someone in Australia, and this, I didn't know I was going to see you today, Helen. But I still keep in touch with a couple of the people on this rig, and I think it was the you know, when I came to King Lake, so many people wanted me to talk about Katrina, and I couldn't understand why people who had been through something so difficult wanted me to talk about something else so difficult. But you all were the ones that awoke me to this deep feeling that we have. We really want to know when we face the unthinkable that others have too. And so I say to everyone who's been through this kind of upheaval, we have descended, all of us are alive today, the products of the people who survived the pandemics, the genocides, the fires, the floods, the upheavals, and the earthquakes, the wars, and everything destructive, humanly created and created by nature. We have within us everything it takes to navigate this. We have to recall it and remind one another that it's there. So that's my offering to you all today. I hope in some way it helps, but to be together is really a joy for me, and I thank you for that. Thank you so much, Daryl, for persisting and helping me through my ineptitude with technology, time, and calendars. I really appreciate it, and thank you, Julian, for that as well.
Thank you, Angela. Yeah, so inspiring. I just think we just throw it open, right? And see where it goes. Any feedback, questions, observations, insights?
Hi, this is Priscilla Abercrombie. I'm in a suburb north of Santa Rosa, where a couple of the devastating fires have been this year, and in the previous 4 years. A lot of us are from this area. I struggle with an issue around, you know, when we talk about how we're really starting from the same place, this idea that we start from the same place. I'm trying to figure out how this fits in the context of equity, in that we don't all start from the same place. We don't have the same privilege. And in a disaster, we have folks that are folks of color who are lower SES, whatever it might be, a disability. Their suffering is different because they never came from the same place of equity or privilege. So I wonder if you have any insight into that, of how, as a woman, a white woman, working with folks of color, for instance, or other folks that don't look like me or have the same abilities I do, you get it.
Yeah. So I think two things. Of course, now we've become, and I'm going to speak very bluntly, I've had, all of my work has been in communities of color, immigrant, low-income communities, all of it, forever. So let me just establish that. Like, I'm not speaking like that's my credential, but what wisdom I've learned from them. All right. So, and then of course my immediate family is very blended, shall we say. So I think two things. One is, yes, we must recognize that if my house is damaged, my priority is to call the insurance company. I mean, I have a whole list of things I do as a person who has benefited from all the structures that we've created to help people in disaster, and a person who knows how to navigate them all, when and where they might be helpful. And then I have a large net community that can help me as well. So one possible error we can make is presuming that a person that is very low income doesn't have anything. So when we were working, for example, with people from New Orleans, we would talk to them about hiring a moving truck. Well, most of the people we worked with from New Orleans had never hired a moving truck in their lives. If they were going to move, they called the 27 family members that existed, that lived within their area, and that's how they moved. They had community. Now, here, they didn't have that. But we were talking with people who had a rich set of assets that were different than the ones we usually count. So the first thing we have to take off is the lens of, if they don't have the assets that you and I think are the vital ones, that means they don't have any. And so we reframed the way when we did intake, we talked to people about relationships and connections, skills and resources that were not the things that we think that upper middle class and upper middle class people have. We helped them inventory those, because that was going to be the foundation of how they moved on. It wasn't going to be calling the insurance company and negotiating time off with their employer and all the, the presumptions that we can make if we're privileged enough to have those things. I think the second thing is, I interviewed a family. I'm gonna try to, I don't want my voice to shake when I tell you this, but this family is very dear to me. I've known them a long time. Their daughter and I are close. They immigrated to Houston from Nicaragua, to the Houston area, probably 30 years ago, from escaping some violence there that was pretty terrifying. And they built a life in a refinery community in South Texas. And their house that the man built with his own two hands was flooded in Allison, it was flooded in Rita, it was flooded in Ike. They moved, then their new house was flooded in Harvey. And last year, the day before Thanksgiving, they were evacuated because a refinery exploded in Port Arthur, Texas. All refineries in Texas and Louisiana are running full tilt, out of control, because there are no constraints on them now. And now the whole family has COVID because Texas reopened. Their middle school child went back to school and contracted it by playing football and gave it to his grandparents, my friend's parents, and both of them are in separate hospitals in Houston. I don't think their grandfather is likely to make it. These people know so much about navigating upheaval. One of the most distinct difference between privileged, not privileged, is we first have to overcome privileged people, the expectation that all this shit's supposed to work for us. Because we act like, how can this possibly be happening to us? We stand right next to people that are thinking, you mean there was a time when that worked for you? And I think that's that's the very first thing, is we've got to enter in a way that respects what they perceive to be the tragedy in the situation, what they experience as the hardship in the situation, and also what they experience as the assets and the resources and the possible path forward. And I think that's if we're great respecters of the sacred ground, meaning I'm interested in entering your world with willing to understand it from your standpoint, how you see it and how you've experienced it, that's a very different, that posture will allow us then to walk with people who do have a different starting place and, quite frankly, desire a different ending. I mean, one of the most difficult conversations I have in this community with privileged people is your idea of a great outcome is just your idea of a great outcome. I mean, it's not what these families are saying they want. You're persisting in some kind of, you know, I've heard people say, well, we have to make sure when we rebuild this low-income community that it's walkable, which is utterly laughable to me, because if you've ever been poor and lived in a low-income community, it's walkable. You walk because you have to. It's just a question of whether it's a pleasant walk or not. So we can't design things for people. We must really listen to what they long and hunger for and design with them. I see in recovery, we're really good initially at listening and paying careful attention when we're in that sort of heart wide open moment. Then we start moving to design and spending money. And that's a very different, then it changes, because we start assuming we know better than community what ought to be built and in what order and with what speed and so forth. So I don't know, Priscilla, if what I said got to the heart of what you were seeking, but I tried. Is that useful at all?
Yeah, it is useful. I think that I am trying to rethink. I spent 30 years working at San Francisco General. I've spent my career working with underserved, and that's where my heart is. And I did work in Katrina. did go down to do work in Katrina, and I've done some different things. But in this environment right now that we're living in, this awareness is very big in me. And so I'm hoping to walk a different walk than maybe I have in my life, with a greater awareness. And yeah, so that's where it came from.
Yeah, it's great. And thank you for being with us after Katrina.
You know, Priscilla's question was so great, and I was thinking, how's Angela going to deal with this? And it was such a brilliant, overview of really what's going on. I'm reminded of something. I was doing some watershed work, and there are a bunch of agencies involved, and we were in a big conference room, and there were 25 people there. And the elected supervisor said to the one Native American who was at the table, he said, Reg, how do we get more Native Americans to the table? And Reg said, well, we don't come to the table, we come to the fire. And that's what you were saying, is you have to go to, it was a wonderful description of how you go to where the people are at. And when you find out where they're at, their capabilities are already there.
Yeah, I have a cardinal, I call it the prime directive: go where you're invited, do what you're asked to do. And then I have a corollary to that in Texan: it ain't help if they didn't ask.
Say that again.
It ain't help if they didn't ask. Yeah. So, yeah. And, I think for people like Priscilla, I mean, you've witnessed how you've seen the struggle. And I think it's when you really honor another person's humanity, you also just have a deep faith and trust that they know what's best for them. And if you trust them, they will tell you what's most top of mind, what it is they most want to accomplish next. And if you don't derail that, then they'll tell you the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And then you have a chance to really share what you have to offer. But it's that deeply respectful starting place that matters.
I love the idea of ceremony that you talked about as well, and Julian just mentioned the importance of a beginning and end, a middle, of marking important times, and doing that in a way that is respectful and culturally appropriate, etc. I know that some of the folks that were burned out in the fire most recently did that through Dios Muertos. And it was, I guess they had a beautiful ceremony at each other's houses that were lost. And I just thought that was so beautiful for them to do that as a community together.
Yeah, yeah. We saw something similar in Houston with people, the loss of life in our region from COVID. Overwhelmingly disproportionately affected Latinos and African Americans. And to use that particular holiday to be able to express grief that had gone unexpressed because the other rituals haven't been available to people as we stumble our way through it. So I think there have probably been some good, probably some of you have actually seen a lot of examples of how people craft rituals to mark the milestones of the journey. That's a whole topic in itself.
So I'm going to encourage the Australians to speak, Les,
What?
because they're so shy. You know how shy they are. So go ahead, Les.
Yes, I've just been writing about my shyness. It's pervasive. Hi, everyone. Yes, I have just been having wonderful exchanges with a friend of mine, Maria, from Thessaloniki in northern Greece. And we met about a year ago up in Thessaloniki. And after about a minute, I found that we were engaged together in deep ancient Greek healing ceremony. And the potency, I put a little note in the chat there about that when you have these massive floods and cyclones and fires and the devastation left from man-made war, that the context is extraordinarily dramatic. There's a drama to it that is a natural, awful drama. And that massive backdrop is an extraordinary context for the simple act of being together. And it doesn't necessarily need to be any dramatic ritual, but there can be a natural unfolding of this quality of ritual and ceremony. Like it comes up in the corroborees of the Australian Aboriginal Indigenous people, that when there is signs of people brains falling to pieces, that is the signal for everyone to come together for social cohesion. So thanks, Angela, for everything you've been saying.
I had a question. These communities, in fact, almost any community, typically establishes itself slowly over time, very organically. Lots of little decisions, and the social fabric is woven carefully over time, it becomes quite rich. And as soon as the infrastructure is burnt down, then that fabric is really exposed to a kind of desiccation. And it can just And then there's many forces that want to come in and take advantage of this and build the physical part back quickly to make a buck. But that physical thing that gets built quickly may not be the organic thing the community wants it to be, because they don't even maybe know what it is. How do you work towards helping the community organically to be regenerate itself so that it can then inhabit the infrastructure that's right for it?
So I'll be really frank, and thank you for that question. In Houston, it looks like, in Houston, this big 627 square mile city with over 2.5 million people is run by developers. And they think the number one tool of community development is a bulldozer.
Sure.
So most of the time, if you are a person with some power, the role that we played in the organization I used to be with is to hold up our hand and say, just a damn minute here. You know, like, can we just have a moment? And, you know, it's Texas. I actually do have to say just a damn minute here, because real polite language here with these fellas won't really work. But it's the fight to really stave off that predatory. You know, we in community development, we don't like to talk about it, but the fact is all the helpers come. We exalt that. We celebrate that. Every person recognizing sacred ground. People like Priscilla show up, but also feral hogs show up too. Predators show up. In Texas, we have this gross, ugly animal called a feral hog, and it is hideous. Everyone hates them. The only thing you do is lock them up or shoot them. They eat everything. They destroy everything. They ruin any ecology they're in. We see those same people after disaster saying, well, how convenient this is burnt to the ground, because this looks like a great place for condos. So there's a bit of a war if you're gonna, and you have to wage it, if you're gonna hold the ground long enough for people to ask themselves, yes, out of everything that we built, that we crafted, because communities are crafted. They're not art, they're craft. They're built slowly over time with people's two hands and head and heart. So, but we need that chance to say, have the conversation with community. When you think about what was most valuable here, what was the most essential building structure, what matters, what did you take people to when you wanted them to understand what was important about this place? Then we get that on the list first. When we were building in Aldine, for example, you know, we really had people bring their photographs. Like, bring a photograph of the things that you remember that were so important that you really want to see a part of the rebuilt community. We blew them up as poster size and put them on the wall so we could actually see what people had the greatest relation to in terms of shapes and sizes and colors. And so, you know, if you have if you're an organization with any power and you've got an advocacy role, a lot of that role is, hold on a minute, you know, and people, you know, people will challenge me by saying, oh, well, that's going to take so much time. Like, well, how long do you think it's going to take if you build something nobody needs or wants and we waste that money? How long is it going to take then? So can we just try to make it, can we just find roots and put them down and let something grow here? But that's an advocacy fight over and over again. And we at Baker Ripley, we found it worked best if we could let those people most impacted carry that message. And so a lot of our work was to prepare them to stand before city council saying, yes, this, not that. And you know, we don't always win because developers have a lot of money and bulldozers. And arrogance and, you know, a lot of other things. But we do what we can with what we have, where we are at the moment. Y'all look up feral hogs. This is the one creature that we should not save. Not the animal, not the four-legged kind, and not the two-legged kind either.
We have them in California too.
Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about. They're awful. I suspect that so many of you already know what I shared, so I wonder if there was anything on those slides that you've had thought to yourself more than once. So, go, Bob.
You know, first of all, it's delightful to see you again. I think it's, I don't know, 3 years ago that I was in Houston. Well, a different
You came
world.
all the way here to see us, see our work. Thank you.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. And you know what I'm curious about is what you've been learning about how to sustain this work for the long term. So it's like, you know, for some of us, kind of like you, I never, you know, disaster was not on my radar until disaster was on my radar. It was all about community building and how do we create what we want. And one of the things that keeps having me come back to disaster is this potential to create the new, to actually create what we want, to get the bulldozers out of there. And in Paradise now, you know, 2 years out, the theme that we started working with last year was regenerating paradise, this sense of a new beginning, this sense of being able to call in what we want. It's 2 years, and it's going to be more. It's going to be 8 years. It's going to be 15 years. What have you been learning about how to sustain a forward momentum?
Okay, that's the great thing about you. All your questions are wonderful. It's nice to see you again. I think I'll go back to something I referred to earlier. We do have to let go of the idea of recovery as a rebuilding what was there before. And I feel like that we can sustain ourselves in the work if we will commit to work that's actually achievable and one that in our rational minds we can justify. In Houston, for example, developers persist in building buildings out of wood, stucco, drywall, and insulation, all mold-loving, water-hating materials that just create enormous disasters, secondary disasters, post any major flooding event, of which we have many. So I think can we sustain ourselves in the work? I think the work itself is to stop doing the unsustainable things, stop trying to go back to what was. And I've had very limited success pushing these folks that say, oh, I've always done this, and this is what we do, and people love these products. And to push people to a point of thinking that we don't have to do that anymore. But I don't think they're fast learners, and what's teaching them is one hurricane after another. Basically, if you don't get it, Mother Nature will keep explaining it to you. It's called logical consequences. You just kind of keep doing, and the water keeps coming. But I think there's a different sustainability. The sustainability of recovery is really totally dependent upon being able to let go of what was. I see the people that drown in the work, and they get lost in two things. They go down the path of resignation, and why is this happening? And oh my God, and it's so terrible, and it's so unjust, and how could they do this? And they're not wrong, but that's how you drown. The other path is, for whatever reason, we're alive now, today, and these are our circumstances. This is what we have to work with. This is who we have to work with. and it's that grounded. And let me say something, I'm just so excited to tell you in defense of millennials who are much unfairly maligned. I almost, don't hold it against me, but I kind of skip the people between me and them, because the 30-year-olds, the 30-somethings, they are natural improvisers. We say they're not loyal to institutions, and I find that to be a joke, because we promised them nothing, and we told them they were on their own for their schooling, their health care. They work in a gig economy. We've shown them no loyalty, and we expect to have some. And they don't have any. They also don't have any loyalty to institutions that we built. They already know don't work. Any millennial knows any bureaucracy they encounter is the lamest thing they've ever seen. And all they think about is how to work around it, under it, and past it. So I've seen in the midst of Harvey, when we had thousands of people in a life or death need of rescue. It was a young man in his 30s who overnight built a platform, a tool that allowed a person who needed to be pulled out of the water, who might have already been posting and tweeting, "Help me." He built a program that assigned them a number, so those people with boats could go to that location and then retire that number. So then we knew they had been rescued. This resulted in over 10,000 rescues. And since that time, that same crowdsourced rescue, Matthew Marchetti is his name, that same platform has been used for storm after storm, not just here, but in other parts of the country, and most recently is being used to get resources and food to seniors. So what I've found with millennials and people who think like them is that they will make it up on the spot. They will not, they don't convene a committee, they don't do a study group, they don't roll out a published paper, they don't attach citations, they craft it. And they put it out and test it, and they improve it as they go. And that methodology, and I know you understand what I'm talking about, but that posture in the world of being willing to do that is something that really frees us and it keeps us from the exhaustion of trying to pretend that these other things that we built, when I was talking with Matthew, he says to me, "Oh, I don't really worry about, don't spread this around. I don't want to out him." But he says, "I don't really worry about Red Cross. These big box nonprofits are dead anyway." And, of course I'm like, wait, I want to say, well, not yet, because they've got a lot of resources and we either need to get the resources out of the institution or make the institution work. But, these young people are thinking past all of that and crafting solutions, and they're natural improvisers. They're attuned to a gig economy. They'll use anything that comes their way and anyone that shows up. So it gives me a lot of hope that they are better suited to a world where we have wave after wave after wave of upheaval than perhaps we are, who still believe that our goals should be safety, security, predictability, and routine. They don't expect that any more than the immigrants that we work with, who've navigated all kinds of unthinkable situations, expect the world to work for them. I feel so self-conscious. I just feel like I just went on way too long. I'm sorry.
No, it's good. I think, Les, did you have a question? You're a millennial, right?
Yes. I'm delighted to be delusionally included in that class. Angela, in talking about this improvisation, we have in Australia the notion of the bush mechanic.
Yes, I love that.
And there's the depiction of this with a group of young Aboriginal fellows that have a music gig about 300 k just around the corner, and their trailer breaks down, the axle, and they've got all their music gear on that, so they cut the top of the car off and use it as a sled because it's all dirt roads. So that is that practical use of what's available.
Mm-hmm.
Before we started expecting institutions, I have to say that some of the employees, team members I would occasionally hire who would say, well, I really couldn't do this because, I really didn't have the tools, and you haven't trained me, and I don't have a guidebook. And I I was not a very patient boss. I would say, if we had all that, I wouldn't have hired you, wouldn't have needed to, So some people can only function if everything's provided, and they make good administrators, and we need good administrators. But when you're talking about disaster, when you don't know what will be provided, when nothing is guaranteed, then that kind of bush mechanic, I think Daryl educated me about that. It was such a great story. The stories he told me were so wonderful, because that is the mindset of less privileged people who've always existed in the estuaries and the margins, crafting what they could, and with no sense of entitlement. I mean, these are not the people that sit down and pout because it was hard.
Just checking on some people that we can't see if they have questions. Susan, David, Asaya, you have any questions?
No, I don't, but it was, I'm out on the land right now, rescuing my garden, my food forest. So, yeah, no, I just appreciate you a lot. I understand that no one's coming to save us, and we have to act as quickly as possible. I took a note down at the beginning when you were speaking, Angela. It was, let's see what my note said. I forgot it, but let me go back to my original screen and then I can pull it up. Let's see.
Was that
So,
the thing?
The work don't wait. That's what I'm doing right now.
Yeah, good for you.
Yeah, so this is me. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, so I'm on a piece of land that they're trying to restore, and these people bought thousands of dollars of plants and did not think about water. So everything is dying, and I think that's just the state of people. How could you spend over $10,000 on, landscaping and agriculture and not, potted trees, and not even consider what something needs?
That hurts. That hurts. Yeah. So is there a chance, are you there because you think you can salvage some of it?
Yeah, I'm there actually rescuing the plants right now and coming up with a water system. I do off-grid water systems, so that's what I'm doing right now, is just coming up with a plan of how quickly in the next couple of days, because I told them they have a week before everything is dead. And I think they're counting on the rain coming, but this is an area that doesn't get much rain.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a concrete lot.
Oh my.
Good job, Asaya.
Good job. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Susan or David, Leon, Zach, you have anything? I'm not picking on you deliberately, just because you can't put your hand up or wave your hand. Okay.
Well, actually, Julian, I want to pick on them directly, because earlier when Angela was talking about ritual and about craft and knowing that this is the anniversary in Paradise, I just found myself thinking about the phoenix, and I wondered if one of you could share that story of that incredible creation.
Key Phoenix. Yeah, so we have a local artist by the name of Jess Mercer, who shortly after the campfire, while we were all desperately trying to figure out where we were going to live and how to get through things day by day and what we were supposed to do with FEMA and the resources that were being delivered to us. Jess put the word out and she said, you know, so many of us have evacuated, and we evacuated with the keys from homes that have burned down. And I'm thinking about making a project, an art project. If you would like to donate your keys to that project, please do.
Wow.
And so she put the call out, and by the end of almost a year's time, she had over 14,000 keys that had been donated. And from those keys, she made a phoenix. And this phoenix was installed at the opening of the new Building Resilience Center in Paradise, so that as people came to get their building permits, they could look to the phoenix that was made of keys of the homes they lost, and be there to receive a permit to build the homes as they rise from the ashes. That's our key phoenix story.
That's super. That's so powerful.
And Angela, yeah, her name again is Jess Mercer. And Jess is participating this year again in the era of COVID, when we're now at the 2nd anniversary of the campfire, which is tomorrow. And of course, we have to be careful with our public gatherings.
Yeah.
One of the public gatherings is we're doing a drive-by wishing well. And Jess has built this beautiful wishing well that folks can drive by and drop in their wish for recovery.
Writing notes, yeah. Yeah. And their wishes about recovery, and their
wishes about the restoration of paradise, what life is going to be moving forward, any category of wish related.
yeah.
Oh, and there's the key phoenix right there.
Oh my God, that's so incredible.
Yeah, it weighs something like 900 pounds. 14,000 keys. That's
Oh, wow.
Jess.
I'm so gonna keep this story in my treasure book. This is
That's Jess Mercer there on, yeah.
These are the rituals that restore us. These are the rituals that find us.
There's this is very reminiscent for me of an artist in New Orleans who, as she was driving the streets of New Orleans at that stage when everybody's belongings were at the curb, which is a little different than a fire, of course. She noticed that in front of every house was a bureau, a chest of drawers, and she began asking owners if she could take one drawer, and if they would tell her what was in the drawer. I know you've seen this, Bob, right? And so she made an enormous art installation, which was an entire wall of drawers stacked one upon another. And each one bore a label saying, you know, this was the drawer where my daughter kept her dance costumes. This was the drawer that I kept my father's World War II medals. And it became much, it was, I'm sure, a bit like this Phoenix. It was a place people could go, just a visual way of seeing what the loss looked like. But I love the Phoenix because, of course, it rises from the ashes. I mean, it's just, what a genius to do that.
Well, it really is she's an extraordinary woman, and we're glad to have her in our midst. She's participating with the new forming Paradise Arts Alliance, which includes representatives from the variety of arts organizations. Our town was a town of 27,000, now it's a town of 4,000. And yet there are a number of folks still here that were parts of various organizations that are joining forces to help recreate this town. We all feel like we're pioneers. everything that we do. And I wanted to share that piece with you as well, just from my personal experience. We were able to stabilize much earlier than many of our friends in the community. When the campfire hit, the day that the town was burning down, our insurance man said there was a housing shortage in Chico yesterday. You got to get out and find yourself a place to live now.
Yeah.
And so we scrambled. Lori went out with a friend of ours, Kate Tranchell, professor of history at CSU Chico. Her friends call her a goddess in a hurry. And so we used our goddess in a hurry, and Lori and Kate found us a very nice apartment in California Park that we could live in and stabilize in for 6 months. And within a week, we were in that apartment. And after we moved everything in, everything's smoky around us. It's terrible. We stink from all the smoke that's descended on the town, which we can barely see through, and we can't breathe, and we've been wearing masks all day long. I had to just go and take a long shower. And so I came out of the shower, and the mirror was thick with fog. And I noticed in the upper right, and apparently the apartment that we moved into had been shared by several college women prior to us moving in. And I noticed that in the mirror up on the upper right, there was this trace writing that I think somebody had written in lipstick, and and the wax had kept the steam from gathering on it. And the words were, "What I do today will make a difference tomorrow."
Oh.
And that brought me back to my Taoist streak, and the idea that we live in the midst of a multiplicity of cascading consequences, and we live creatively with that. So there's stuff that's come our way that's happening all over the place. We're going to contribute to what's happening in that flow, and what comes after us is going to make the difference for the circumstances for somebody next. And so we're here in Paradise. We think of ourselves as the new pioneers, and we're serious about that. We know that what we're doing is going to contribute to the framing of our town as it rises. It's going to create a context of possibility for other creatives as they create the world that comes after them. So that's the reality in which we're living right now.
So
And
oh, sorry, go ahead. No.
And the last thing, well, not the last thing, because I just wanted to reflect back something to you, but at the anniversary of the campfire, we brought together artists from all around our community because we had grown aware by July of 2019 that folks had been writing songs, they had been painting watercolors and oil paintings, they'd been writing poems, folks had dedicated dance pieces. Butte Strong, Paradise Strong was being worn everywhere. There were sculptures happening. People were making sense of their catastrophic experience through art. And it reminded me of after the campfire, when our landscape was completely black, we had a rain. And soon after that rain, these slender green shoots poked up through the black of the burn scar. And it was evidence of the wondrous power of growing things. And it was a symbol that life itself is resilient. And a symbol of hope, because, you know, not some people hate hope. Some people think it's a way of thinking in terms of fantasy. It's wishful thinking. And it distracts you from the pragmatic. I disagree. I think we come into suffering and we are challenged to imagine how that can transform into good and wonderfulness again. And hope is that thing that remembers the process of life that creates those slender green shoots of grass that can rise from the blackened landscape of our burned lives. That life will find a way, that joy will find a way. And so as we saw evidence of that green shoot of grass popping up through the creative spirit in our community, we wanted to figure out how to celebrate that, how to reflect back to our community that resilience is happening, that we are recovering, that life is rising within us, and it's most evidenced by the creative spirit. And so we pulled together this show called Joy Will Find a Way, Experience Butte County's Resilience Through the Arts. And we had 150 participants. We had Paradise Symphony Orchestra and the CSU Chico NB Hip Hop team. And we had 229 poets at Paradise High School wrote a poem called 86 Wishes for a New Dawn, and they partnered with the orchestra, and they partnered with a filmmaker, and we had a multi-faceted arts piece, and we had singer-songwriters and poets and artists that brought their works to put on display in the lobby, and it was a wonderful piece. We ended up making, and Alan Myers, who's one of our number, I don't see him here right now, but he made an excellent 7-minute film. If you haven't watched it, I encourage you to. It's called A Message from the Future of Paradise. And so many great things were done at that show. We ended up making a film of it, and we're screening the film tomorrow night at the 2nd anniversary. So again, putting the light on the arts, putting the light on the creative spirit, wanting to encourage folks to express their resilience and their recovery through the arts to keep ourselves encouraged. Last, I wanted to reflect back to you some of what I heard. I loved your sayings. Go where you're invited. Do what you're asked to do. I like that.
Full stop. Yeah.
Full stop.
Full stop, yeah.
I also love this. It ain't help if they didn't ask.
Thank you. Right.
What a wonderful saying. I'm pinning this stuff up on my mental wall, and I'm going to put it up on my physical walls. And then this other thing, which I think is important to us in our recovery right now. I mentioned we were a town of 27,000. Now we're a town of 4,000. And you said, as people show up each day, you ask the question, are you in or are you out? Are you in or are you out? And I'm a guy that was involved with one volunteer organization prior to the campfire, and now I'm involved with 5.
Wow.
And I still work for a living.
Are you in or are you out? You sound very in. I think you're very in, David.
I don't know how not to be in, but what I'm curious about, and you may have spoken to this, but I had to come late because I had an obligation earlier. But I'm curious, Angela, how do you, and you may have shared this before, but if you can briefly just tell us, how do you care? How do you nurture your own spirit? What is the essential boil down for you that you do every day to take care of that part of you that connects to the resource that keeps you going?
So, I mean, I have my own prayer and meditation practice, and then I garden, but the real truth is there is no deeper well of meaning for me than the one I dip into every time I'm with people like you, recreating life and meaning out of destruction and suffering. So, I mean, what is better than that? I mean, isn't that the church we'd all go to, or the temple we'd all sign up for? It's the whole enchilada, as we say in Texas. So yeah, that's it. I mean, this to me is the whole thing right here. Okay, I'm so excited, but I want to say a couple of things only. When you talk of hope, and this now it's supposed to be fashionable not to have hope. If we're to abandon hope, we also have to refrain from having imagination and curiosity and joy, and we have to stop being the shiny object inquisitive species that we are. So hope for me is when you're able to entertain the possibility without regard for the resources currently controlled. And I just want to say that again, we can entertain the possibility without regard for the resources currently controlled. So, and I make a distinction between hope and expectation. And here's how you know whether you were hopeful or you had an expectation born of entitlement. If you're hopeful and it doesn't work out, you may feel some sadness and you may feel some disappointment. You may even feel curiosity about, well, now, what's another way I might approach that? But if you have an expectation and it didn't work out, you get pissed off and you sulk, or you pout, or you become outraged, or you get your indignation, you're awash in it. And I watch people all the time confuse the two things. You know, hope for me is a way of life. But much like all the people I've learned from, I don't have an expectation that the world should work for me. When I really have got somebody I got to really straighten out on this front, I said, and what made you think the axis of the universe ran down your spine? You know, that it was all going to turn on you. You here in this moment of time with your limited ideas, your paltry little lens through which you see things, you think it should work the way you think it should work. Amazing. How ridiculous, you know? So it's, I think art springs from hope. Everything that makes us human springs from hope. We get into trouble if that becomes expectation. If our wishes become demands. You know, amongst couples, you know, there's always, if I ask you for something and yes or no are equally acceptable, then it was a request. But if I ask you for something and I'm pissed off when you say no, it was a demand. That's on me. So we have to monitor ourselves for what we demand of the world and caution ourselves against the demand. The world, we are promised nothing. We're just a species, shipwrecked on a small blue ball, and vast infinite, and you know, making our way and trying to make sense of it. So I loved everything you said about just beautiful stories that you tell. The rain and the shoot springing up, I can imagine what that felt like to see it, you know, because the charred remains, that's the most shocking, that's a picture once in your mind, it really never leaves you. But I imagine those shoots appearing really stays with you even more.
So Angela, we've been going for an hour and 40 minutes. So I'm going to ask you to just say how long that you would be willing to go for, and then we can do a hard stop there.
Well, bless your heart, haven't you been at this all day, some of you?
Yeah, we've been at it all day. Yeah, since 8:30 this morning.
Well, I'm here. You do what you like. I'm here for you, Julian. Do what you like.
Okay. Well, Daryl has his hand up, and I'm glad because I was getting really worried that he hasn't asked a question yet. Go ahead, Daryl.
Angela, I've got two questions. And so one's about commons and the other one's kind of about coaching. So the first one, you know, we've seen a bit of a shift in Australia of late from just a focus on individuals, you know, to more what we can do together when we turn to one another. And the commons keeps coming up. And, you know, when I came to New Orleans, it was with, you know, I also met the Haitians, some Creole speaking Haitians from Port-au-Prince after their earthquake. And, you know, it was a disaster conference that I came to, and people from all over the world came, and we sat in New Orleans in restaurants until the early hours. And it was great consolation that we gave one another, but it was also great inspiration that we found in each other's story and how that adapted to their circumstances. And, you know, I learned that each disaster is unique and each community is unique and each the way they come together and, you know, their context, their history and all of their relationships. But also, you know, there was so much in common, and we were all astounded by how much we had in common. In the United States, are you involved in anything that talks about that shipwreck survivor commons?
Sometimes I feel like I'm trying to create something like that out of thin air. So there are, I think right now in the U.S., this is only, please accept what I'm about to say is limited, you know, my little aperture, so incomplete. But as you know, the U.S. has this obsession, a toxic, we like to take individualism to its toxic extreme. So, and then as a corollary to that barrier to seeing this common journey, or seeing the journey, the shipwreck journey as common, another corollary is when disasters happen, we obsessively focus on the stuff. So this is what you would accept. You've got an individualistic, materialistic culture that we're trying to work our way out of, trying to survive, that focuses on what every individual gets to decide, you know, whether they wear a mask or not, or what the hell they're going to do with their property. It's all individual. And then, you know, and then we focus on the stuff. So I think I see within academic institutions, in Northeastern University, I attended this, it was a large research collaboration that's been formed, Daryl, and it's a very robust, and what made it robust and what made it so something I think we're celebrating was that so many folks came from, you know, Germany and Australia, other places, Japan, because there was something other than the American narrative of everybody just in some cowboy fashion, you know, rides off on their own and triumphs. While I do believe every disaster is unique, I've devoted the last couple of years, and will devote however long it takes me or however the rest of my life, on putting together the piece. What you saw today is a part of a much larger project that I've been working on, because I do think there's a universal journey here. Exodus is one of the oldest human stories. Since we've been in existence, we've been faced as vulnerable creatures with the job, if you will, the task of recreating our lives after destruction and upheaval. So it can't be that it's that different from place to place, is my assumption. And when I listened to all of you today, one of the slides I left out was a slide that I use for the people organizing right after disaster. I say, allow everything that is not destructive, especially art, because it's in the attempt to control the circumstances, we start making rules when what we really need is to abandon them. And but so, you know, the fact that that came up today doesn't surprise me, because I can't tell you a story in any culture, any place on earth, no matter the circumstances, including the kind of disaster that I perceive Ferguson, Missouri, and many other places to be after these horrific police murders. In these places too, where there's just an overwhelming amount of suffering and hurt, art springs up. The art becomes a vehicle for a shared grasp of the experience, for a shared understanding. And you know, when we have to do this in Houston, you know, we in the shelter, we prepared for 24 different languages. We used 19 of them the first night to say welcome. And so art transcends language. And where you're working in places where the we has to include people. Another thing to say about our region, in this region, 70% of the people that live in this 5.5 million region were born elsewhere. And over 25% of them, I think if you look at the whole region, it's probably closer to 40% were born outside the country. We don't share a past. We don't share a past. So if we don't allow art that speaks to what we do share as human beings, then we try to navigate doing a common, what can we say is common? Well, I summarize it this way: earn, learn, belong. Wherever I've been, whether in the work I've done, whether community development or disaster recovery, these three hungers seem to be universal. We all have a wish to be able to do something that others value. We earn. We earn our place in the community by what we do, what we offer, what we have to contribute. I'm not talking about capitalism. I'm talking about the simple act of offering what we have to uniquely share with others. Learn, we are natural learners. We are inquisitive, we are curious. We wish to be treated as though we are unfinished. And that's true everywhere. It's true in prisons, it's true in refugee camps in Jordan, it's true after disasters. And when we don't think that we can secure that for ourselves, we are fiercely determined to have it for our children. And it's at the top of the list, whether you're in a camp or in the richest neighborhood in Houston. Learning, earn, learn, and then the third is belong. We want to feel that we are welcome on the ground we stand upon. I mean, that when we walk down the street in the place that we call home, that we'll be welcomed there, we'll be accepted there, we'll be safe there. So earn, learn, belong. And oftentimes when people say, well, what is the work of rebuilding? I ask them, so what's happening with earning? What's happening with jobs? What's happening with work? Because for adults in this country, they need to wrap their minds around that reality. Second, what's happening with children's schooling? I know one thing for sure: if all hell breaks loose and everything falls apart, and you want to restore, you want to do the thing that has the most immediate impact to restore some sort of order and security, you get the school open, which is what makes COVID so damn difficult. When after every disaster, if you get school open in Zaatari, in the desert in Jordan, where 80,000 people, an improvised settlement of 80,000 people, a city of tents and temporary buildings. The highest priority item for the parents there was, will you have a school for my children? And by creating a school, they created order, they created routine, they freed parents to work in the instance of fire and flood. If the kids can go to school, even an improvised one, it frees the parents to work on the work of recovery. So earn, learn, belong. Creating a sense of identity and belonging, people fashioned that in Zaatari. So when I say desert, I had not traveled a great deal in the true deserts of the Middle East. And when I was in Jordan, I had no experience of being on a ribbon of road where as far as I could see ahead of me, as far as I could see behind me, to the left and to the right was sand. And in that environment, they created this whole city to welcome Syrians to Jordan. And in that Zaatari were the people, parents went to work immediately if they knew how to repair bicycles, despite the fact that technically in camps you're not supposed to have enterprises. They set up, if they had, they made a booth, And in that booth, they repaired shoes or bicycles, whatever they could do. People desperately wanted to work and offer something. And then they made schools. And then they created an identity for the camp and neighborhoods within it. So when you see that happen under those conditions, my sense is, aren't we looking at something that is fundamentally true about us? Because if you go, wherever you go, whatever the circumstances, here we go again. Am I going on too long? Okay, please.
I've got a second. The second question that I had was about, I'm just rather reflecting back. I used to be a sports coach, so I've coached tennis and football here. And, you know, there's kind of like the long game that you play as well as the short game. And I've been thinking about almost like the offense. So the spontaneous things that emerge in the aftermath of disasters are always extraordinary. They're almost intoxicating for me. It's so exciting to see these things just pop up and pop up and pop up again. The adaptation that people make and the transformation that they also make when they let go of that need to recreate exactly what was. All of those things I completely agree with as being really, really important. And I see that almost like the offense in a sports game, but the defense, the preparedness, the prevention and mitigation work, you know, this is where the real bang for the buck is in the long term. You know, what can we, you know, as well as adapting, you know, what sort of mitigation, prevention, deep preparedness work that we do, you know, that's all inherent in what we do in offense in terms of the learning that we garner from our experiences. But, you know, how are you seeing that play out after, you know, massive events like Sandy and other things that have happened in the US? Like I met with people in Greensburg where they'd lost 97% of their infrastructure and they were recreating their town, but they were always also trying to think about, you know, how do we prevent the worst from happening, you know, or prevent these things from becoming increasingly worse. And you've seen the hurricane seasons become increasingly worse in your area. And you've also spoken with me about, you know, the concurrent disasters with all the petroleum infrastructure in your region. So, you know, that kind of systemic prevention as well as the specific response. You know, how does that kind of play out for you?
So this is in Ike. Okay, when Ike struck, Ike was 2008. When Ike hit the Gulf Coast, Houston was without power in some areas for 6 weeks, but over, I think, 1.5 million people were without power for some period of time. It was a massive story. Not everyone was paying attention to it because that was also the year in which you found out that you were broke. You know, 2008, the financial markets fell apart and people were focused on that disaster. Here's what we dreaded in Houston that did not happen. Ike was terrible, but the hurricane didn't come up the ship channel. The ship channel in Houston is completely unprotected. It's a 40-mile channel that's been dug from the Gulf of Mexico to Houston to guarantee the rapid and swift delivery of crude oil to the multiple refineries that exist on that 40-mile channel. Virtually half of the United States depends on the petrochemical products that flow into and out of those refineries through a massive network of pipelines. The most significant oil and gas energy infrastructure in the United States is located on the Gulf Coast, fully exposed to massive hurricanes. So we both refine and produce the product that continues to contribute to the warming, that continues to foster the larger hurricanes, that continue to threaten the production of that product upon which all of us depend. So, and we discussed during Ike, and there were efforts after Ike to pursue a design for a set of locks and gates that would prevent the nightmare of Houston, which is a hurricane comes up the ship channel. And however you feel about petrochem, I will tell you this. If the Port of Houston and the refining capacity of the Gulf Coast shuts down, you have about 6 weeks of business as usual. And then then the shit hits the fan. Because this is not, I think most people have this vision of oil and gas as some evil thing that happens, and and that there's oil stored somewhere, and if we stop making it, we'd have some for a while. But the fact of the matter is, ships come in with crude, heavy crude, and I'm explaining this to you for a reason, if you'll stick with me. It comes into a refinery designed to refine heavy crude. And then we frack from Texas crude that is much lighter, which we then ship to Canada for those refineries, which are suited to refining lighter crude, which then goes back into pipelines all over Canada and the United States. And what we refine today, 24 million gallons of crude oil today were refined in one refinery in Texas, Baytown. That refinery is an ExxonMobil refinery larger than the city of San Francisco. And when it was refined today, it went into pipelines, and that pipeline went to the airport, and that diesel fuel went into the air, that aviation fuel went into the airplane, and the airplane took off. Moreover, only 40 to 50% of a barrel of oil ends up being spent in your gas tank or your airplane. The rest of it is in the tarmac, it's in the roads, it's in your bicycle seats. Every one of you is wearing clothing made possible by petrochem. And we do not have in this country an energy policy. We have no coherent energy policy or plan to try to evolve us from that dependency. We have a petrochem dependent civilization and no plan for how to get from that to something that will not continue to create larger hurricanes that threaten the petrochem industry. So I thought after Ike, maybe we would think about an infrastructure for the protection of the Port of Houston. For a minute, everyone seemed to realize, wow, something should be done here. And that plan never got off the ground. And I put this question to you all because I don't know the answer. We do not have, this is the way I grasp it, we lack the governing structures that have the capability to sit at a table to entertain the problems we're currently experiencing. We lack the governing structures, the global international structures that could allow the cooperation needed to address climate change. Within our own country, we lack a governing structure that allows us to contend with and develop a plan and a policy that would recognize the threat of climate change. We lack a governing structure that can even entertain the possibility of a sane migration from petrochem dependency to something else. And since Ike, by the way, since Ike, not one single thing has been done. We are sitting ducks for a hurricane season that will come around next year, where hurricane after hurricane will aim itself at the hurricane alley that we created when we dug the port, which will threaten the core and the heart of a petrochem industry upon which we all depend. We often think we can do without it, but if you go to the hospital and you have an IV, it's because we refined it here. If you get on your bicycle and you have tires and a seat, we refined it here. If you buy the water, those wonderful moisture wicking clothes, refined it here. So I want not to know this. You know, I would, in the perfect world, I would not know this. and much less bore you with an overview of the petrochem industry. But we have not evolved the systems of cooperation and governing that allow us to contend with the challenge we face. And I had a brief hope that climate change would be the thing that taught us interdependency and allowed us to transcend in some way national boundaries and interests, to come together to get a handle on our situation. But if you all can point to evidence of us moving in that direction, I look for it every day. But I know where I sit, we haven't done it.
You know, Angela, I want to go back to what you said about the millennials, and I don't want to put it all on them, but it's things like my daughter, who's 33 now, works in the biodiversity initiative at the United Nations Development Program.
Yeah.
And one of the teams that she's been working with is a team of data scientists who have been pinpointing, using satellite data, have been pinpointing what are the corridors that need to be kept open in South America to allow biodiversity to continue to be present. And so it's this very, both, you know, from up here and down here, big picture and very focused picture of work. And it's that, you know, it's not going to be these old white guys sitting around tables creating policies. It's going to be people who are able to come in from those kind of new perspectives and say, we can shift here. This is a place that's an acupressure point. That's what gives me hope. The more people like the Mitch in Houston who says, shit, I got this, we can do this. You know, it's like, how do we foster that kind of creativity? That's where my hope is.
So, Helen, did you have a question?
Yeah, I've been sitting here thinking the combination of Angela, and I don't know how you regard Brené Brown's work on vulnerability, Angela, but it seems to me from a system psychodynamic point of view, the fact that there has been no development, and we see it here on most counts, my feel is that that it's a huge defense against anxiety, that people, they cannot afford to grasp or own what you've talked about, that it's too unthinkably threatening. And I think the notion of developing more literacy around the idea of vulnerability that Brené talks about, and I know you talk about in your work, if we could own that, we could perhaps move forward, but I don't think we can.
Yeah, I think her vulnerability is a very different kind than I'm speaking of, really.
Yeah.
And but I mean, we're both from Houston, so it comes up a lot. I actually think that kind of vulnerability is a little bit, we spend too much time on that and not enough time on the more existential nature of some of the situations we're facing now. And I think, Helen, you're onto something, because I do feel and in some sense that's true of her work, we want a safe world, but we make investments so that we have safety, security, predictability, and we want to guarantee something that is not guaranteeable. And our insistence that we have this predictable supply of so many things in the sense that we're entitled to them is actually making our world more and more dangerous, and more, making us more vulnerable, not less. So I think that we instead of insisting on any form of safety, it's coming to terms with the journey that we're on, which is one of the human condition, which is one of profound vulnerability, where every single thing that we love and care about is subject to removal, because that's the nature of being alive as a human being. And so, you know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, and this is what we don't have to tell Indigenous people, you know? We don't have to explain this to African Americans in many neighborhoods in the country. So so some of that other kind of vulnerability talk has really been very much the conversation for a lot of privileged people seeking some emotional safety. And this is really not to disparage her work, but I don't, it's just some other separate thing. My feelings are hurt or not, or my boss speaks to me rudely or not, irrelevant. I mean, we're actually working here. We're talking about a sense of coming to terms with a much deeper, more profound understanding of our condition and our circumstances, such that we stop insisting on things that ought not to be, considered guaranteeable and secured forever. We've always secured those things at the expense of others too. Those of us who've had an insistence that every time we turn on the lights, they come on, which is most certainly not true in Lebanon, and is damn sure not true in Jordan in the desert. They have electricity from 4 to midnight. That's it. Everything we insist on and we think is actually just foundational to a tolerable life. All of that has to be examined. So that needs to be, that's the trouble that I see with us, is that we want to guarantee things that can't be had by everyone and can only be secured for some at the expense of others, and sometimes even at our own expense. Have it now and no one else can have it later. So yeah, it's like we're missing the part that says that, let me tell you how I shorten that into Texan. This ain't heaven, it's earth.
I'll just make one comment, picking up on something that David, that you said about Alan Meyer's film, Regenerating Paradise. I'm organising a symposium, and we've got Alan's film. It'll be shown during a congress by the World Psychiatric Association on innovations in community psychiatry, and linking in with all of these other dimensions of human experience. So that'll be happening in mid-December.
So, Angela, I don't want to take advantage of your generosity. So maybe one more question, and then you have the final word from someone who hasn't asked the question or made a comment. Richard?
Yeah, Angela, I've been wondering about the tension between showing up without a linkage to local authority and what the nature of invitations you've experienced, because it's one thing to show up with a connection to someone who has some authority, and it's very different to show up because you're ready to go to work.
You're muted.
Yeah, so there are times, Richard, when I've been invited by the formal authorities. I actually got a call from Chico, an elected official in Chico, in the aftermath of the Paradise Fire, who was calling. I don't even remember how she got my name. I think it's right next to Things Fall Apart on the little on the ledger. But it's one thing. You can be invited by formal authority. I'm an elected official. Can you come here and help guide us? So I try to follow this principle. If I've been invited by elected authority, then I stay within that arena. I don't take the fact that I was invited by an elected formal person of informal authority as an invitation to wander through and help myself to any other room or decision-making body. So it's respecting the boundaries of the invitation. In my work at Baker Ripley, we would sometimes be invited by a combination of community residents who had seen work elsewhere and said, can you please, Bob shaking his head because I think he knows, like Aldine unfolded that way, because the residents of Aldine saw work we had done elsewhere and said, could you come and work with us the way you worked with Gulfton? And that was also facilitated in that instance by an elected official. There are times when we've been contracted with by FEMA to do certain work. It's whatever the invitation, we try to obey the boundaries of the invitation and don't imagine that, don't behave like colonists and say, well, somebody said we could land here, so we must own it, the whole thing, you know? So is that useful?
Well, yeah, there's a real difference. I was thinking about your description of the refugee camp in Jordan. I mean, anything is possible there because there's nothing to work with. But if you show up in a community where there was everything, there are a lot of ideas that get in the way of really being creative to solve the problems at hand.
Well, I'm going to have to blow up your assumption about the nothing to work with, because the most entertaining story, I had the great delight of working with two fellows that were responsible for the kind of the infrastructure aspects of this camp. And of course, their desire was to create as orderly a place as possible. And being very good infrastructure folks, they thought a grid was perfect. And that, you know, they would set these tents, initially it was tents, and these temporary buildings up in this kind of nice orderly grid. Everybody would go to bed for the night. When they got up the next morning, they were all moved. And so this was aggravating to people desirous of order. But the Syrians coming in were reorganizing them along the lines of the people they knew in their communities, and also kind of in a more circular fashion. So their reaction finally, first they thought, that's all right, this will stop when we start putting the small buildings, because they aren't going to be able to move those. Well, not true. So they would build these small little things that would allow them to roll. So then they did what any good community developer would do. They called the community together and they said, here's the map. You can't do anything here, here, and here, because this is going to be a water tower, and that's going to, where would you like to live? And then the rest of the camp, now it's shaped the way people wanted to live next to one another. So even in a desert, the people bring with them a desire, that people carry a design in their mind. They're not always aware of it. And when your gift to them is to ask a question that allows them to say out loud what they see in their head as community. So, yeah. But
I call that enormous creativity. You described looking northeast, south, and west and seeing nothing but sand. And out of that emerged these circles and neighborhoods and water towers. So that was what, you couldn't do that in paradise.
No, you can't do that in paradise. You have building codes. Yeah.
So Angela, thank you so much. I've really learned a lot, and I appreciate it a lot. Grateful for your time, and I'm sure that I express the same sentiments of other people. As you can tell, this is quite a fascinating group of people, and they probably keep going, right? And so maybe at some point in the future, there'll be some sort of contact somewhere, somehow, and there'll be a follow-up. Who knows?
Well, I do this to make storm friends. So I hope that you'll remember me and stay in touch and tell me your stories. That's how I keep going. You've been wonderful. This has been great. And Daryl, thank you so much for making this happen. I really appreciate you. And also you, Julian. Great facilitation. Bye, old friend Bob, and bye, old friend Helen, and bye, new friend David. And we'll see you all again, I hope, before too long.
Goodbye, everybody.
You be well.
Right.
Goodbye, everybody. Bye, Daryl. Daryl's gone. Daryl. Bye. Thank you. See ya.